This week's episode of Asia News Weekly was made possible with help from QuickPod. If you have an action cam and are looking to capture videos of yourself snowboarding, scuba diving, parasailing, and more, pick up the new QuickPod Sport. Japan's collective self-defense. Just what is North Korea doing? And China faces large protests. These stories and more are on the July 4th edition of Asia News Weekly. Welcome to Asia News Weekly. I'm your host, Steve Miller. Before we begin with this week's digest, I'd like to welcome our new listeners from Asia Pundits. I hope you'll enjoy the podcast and, of course, share your thoughts and opinions. This week, our first story is from Japan. Since the end of the Second World War, Japan has operated under what many have called a pacifist constitution. Previous administrations interpreted elements of Article 9 to mean Japan could not carry out military operations abroad. The world has changed a lot since 1945, and when current Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came into office, he made known his intentions to lift that barrier. Abe's original plan was to change the nation's constitution to rewrite the provision in Article 9. However, there was insufficient support for that effort. He shifted gears and worked with the cabinet to reinterpret the article to allow for collective self-defense, an inherent right given to all sovereign nations. Andrew Hovert, a visiting professor at Josai International University in Chiba, who researches post-war reconciliation in Europe and Asia, said, quote, "A lot of Japanese people think it's Article 9 that has brought them peace. People identify with this, and it's difficult to suddenly accept the idea that peace is purchased at a price. And that price is vigilance. And vigilance requires armed forces or a credible response to countries that don't buy into the idea of peace." End quote. Hovert makes an excellent point. Many opposed to the notion of reinterpreting the article only look at one provision, the ability to deploy troops abroad. However, what's often been overlooked, and what the Abe administration did a poor job of explaining, was how limiting the provisions were in protecting Japanese citizens in the face of increased piracy in Southeast Asia and China's expansion in the China Sea. Tuesday, Abe announced the cabinet agreed to revise its understanding of Article 9 and allow a policy change. Quote, "By improving deterrence and contributing more to regional and global peace and stability, I believe we can better assure Japan's own peace and security," Abe said Tuesday in Tokyo. "We will continue to defend the pacifism contained in the Constitution. There will be absolutely no change in the path of peace Japan has walked since the war. Instead, this will make that path even more certain." The United States has been a fervent supporter of the change. When Abe made the announcement, U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel said it would make more effective the working relationship between the United States and Japan. Quote, "This decision is an important step for Japan as it seeks to make a greater contribution to the regional and global peace and security. The new policy also complements our ongoing efforts to modernize our alliance through the revision of our bilateral guidelines for defense cooperation." End quote. While Japan's allies may be applauding the change, all is not well domestically as opposition to the change came to a head this week. June 29th, a man self-immolated while sitting atop a pedestrian bridge in Shinjuku, a central part of Tokyo. Quote, "He was sitting cross-legged and was just talking, so I thought it would end without incident. He was yelling against the government about collective self-defense, but when I came back to the same place 30 minutes later, he was still there. Then all of a sudden his body was enveloped in fire," said Ruichiro Nakatsu, who witnessed the incident. Thousands even protested outside the office of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on Monday, demanding the plan to reinterpret Article 9 be abandoned. "Protect the Constitution," they shouted. "Stop war. Stop Abe. Abe, quit right now." Yoshifu Arita from the Democratic Party of Japan joined the protesters, calling the cabinet's decision a coup attempt. It's a sentiment echoed by Ro Ire from Kyushu. Quote, "I heard a lot from my grandfather about the war. He was in Manchuria, and his superiors killed Chinese people. I learned about the importance of Article 9 through those tragic stories. The Constitution is supposed to be a means for the people to restrain the government. Abe is trying to overturn that completely. This plan is a coup d'etat against the Japanese people." End quote. Recent polls, including some as recently as Wednesday, place more than half the population against the shift in policy. Darth JF commented on our Wednesday Asia Now podcast, "I think Japan has the right to collective self-defense like any other country. But Abe is just arbitrarily changing the interpretation of the Constitution with a cabinet decision. In a democracy, there are procedures that you should follow, and I don't think the Abe cabinet simply going around them is good for democracy in Japan." Many others simply asked, "Why do you want to make war, Japan?" In Korea, which has strongly opposed the move, protesters outside the Japanese embassy said the move was tantamount to declaring a return to militarism. National Assembly floor leader Lee Won-koo said, "Japan is walking on a path deviating from what normal countries should do in the 21st century." China, for its part, has also chimed in. Quote, "Due to historical reasons, the policy move of Japan in the fields of military and security has been highly watched by its Asian neighbors and the international community," said China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Hong Lee. He continued, "We also noted some strong opposition within Japan against the right to exercise collective self-defense. We opposed Japan's move to deliberately fabricating the threat of China so as to serve its own domestic political purposes." South Korea's President Park Geun-hye said Korea should not view Japan's decision too emotionally. Korea should receive Japan's promise that it would not adapt policies of militarism or territorial expansion in the future. Pentagon spokesman Rear Admiral John Kirby said, "Now there is a lot of work left to do inside the Japanese government on this policy change that they're seeking. It's a democracy. They've got a Diet that needs to vote on this. I mean, there's a lot of work left to do. We, frankly, think it's a very encouraging sign and will help inform the revision of the defense guidelines, bilateral defense guidelines that we have with Japan. So it helps inform that process, which, as you know, is ongoing. So for us, we find it very, very helpful. And there is no reason from our perspective to believe or to worry that it'd make tensions worse. And quite the contrary. We think it will help with security and stability in the region." Kirby's right, and so is Abe for pushing for the change. What everyone has done is do a bad job of selling it. Too many are focused on the troop deployment and combat aspects of the policy shift, which is important, but not what's driving Abe. If a submarine, say from China, enters Japanese waters, the self-defense forces can do virtually nothing. If pirates hijack a ship with Japanese citizens, Japan can't take any action to rescue them and must rely on another nation. Collective self-defense isn't about waging war. It's about protecting yourself. The limits on the previous interpretation would be analogous to a bully pushing you around school and being unable to respond because your hands were tied behind your back. Just because one can lift a rifle and fire a shot doesn't mean one chooses to do so. Leaving Article 9 the way it was also won't prevent other elements from taking shots at Japan. The world has evolved since the creation of the SDF, and so must it. Besides, without collective self-defense, how long do you think the United States would be willing to be Japan's defender? Defense partner, yes, but not the strong arm of the nation. This divisive issue is sure to grip Japan for months to come, and I welcome your comments on the subject. Be sure to listen to Monday's Asia Now podcast for one resident's view and concern about this policy shift. Later, updates from Thailand as the junta moves forward with its plan to restore democracy. Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in Seoul Thursday for a two-day state visit with South Korean President Park Geun-hye. It's the first time in 20 years a sitting Chinese leader has visited South Korea before visiting the North, and that may be the reason behind the DPRK's sudden onslaught of missile launches and other inflammatory remarks towards their southern neighbor. Last week, The commander of the Southwestern Front of the North Korean People's Army said South Korea committed such a grave military provocation as firing shells in the waters of the DPRK side when it carried out live fire drills near the country's border islands in the Yellow Sea, including Yeonpyeong, which was the scene of a deadly shelling in 2010. The following day, North Korea announced a successful test of, quote, a new high-precision tactical guided missile. It's not believed that North Korea has such a weapon, but has probably obtained a missile similar to the Russian Kh-35. South Korea detected 3 missiles fired into the East Sea, Sea of Japan. Technically, obviously any launch of anything is problematic, is escalatory in nature, is threatening, said U.S. State Department spokeswoman Marie Harf. North Korea then fired more missiles on the 28th of June. Those appeared to be Scud-class medium-range missiles. The DPRK is prohibited from firing such weapons under UN sanctions. Michael Miner, a scholar at Harvard University and a fellow with Pacific Forum of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, said the launch was a show of strength. Unpredictability and instability is so critical to playing a strong hand for the leadership. They are pushing the peace and stability angle to remind everyone things can stay as is, or relatively stable, but if that balance is upset in any way, here's what we could do if we wanted at the drop of a hat. Again, the actions were nothing more than Kim Jong-un trying to grab headlines, stay relevant, and act out as Xi's South Korean visit approached, something he proved on July 2nd when he ordered 2 additional short-range KN-09 missiles fired. China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Hong Lee dismissed that notion, saying, I don't see any basis for this link. However, North Korea did call China its sworn enemy, and according to an unnamed source that provided the information to Korea's Chosun Ilbo, a signboard at a cadet school read, China is a betrayer and our enemy. The source even added, if they're driven into a corner, they won't hesitate to go to war against China. Since Kim carried out North Korea's 3rd nuclear test last year, China has slowly been distancing itself. This week's meeting with Park is expected to cover a wide variety of topics, one of which will be how to deal with North Korea. Since China has been moving away, Kim has been looking to other regional partners, most notably Russia. With North Korea preparing for its 4th nuclear test, what Park needs to secure from this meeting is a clear idea of how China will respond. And that's the question I have for you. With North Korea vying for attention, when it finally does carry out the next nuclear test, what do you think China will do? You can visit AsiaNewsWeekly.net for links to the stories mentioned in this week's podcast. While there, you can leave your thoughts in the comment section, or do it via Facebook or Twitter. Just go to facebook.com/AsiaNewsWeekly or follow @AsiaNewsWeekly on Twitter. Army General Prayut Chan-o-cha announced last week a temporary constitution had been drafted and sent for legal review. He did this without specific details. However, General Prayut did say it was his intent to submit the measure for endorsement to the king this month, after which he feels it should be sometime around September when the document would then take effect. General Prayut added a permanent constitution would be ready in about a year, with free and fair elections taking place after that, sometime around October in 2015. He urged patience as political reforms were implemented. According to those in support of the junta, and against it, the National Council for Peace and Order, or the NCPO, is trying to remove all influence from Thaksin Shinawatra, who, while ousted from his role, has been pulling the strings of subsequent governments. One of the goals of the junta, according to its supporters and opponents, is to permanently eradicate Thaksin's influence from Thai politics. Thai Permanent Secretary for Defense Shurasak said political party reform, decentralization of power, and investigations and penalties for those groups that commit electoral fraud were top on the military's agenda. We will talk about obstacles to an election and corruption. In a BBC interview, Army Deputy Chief of Staff Chacharam invited Thaksin to return from his self-imposed exile. Quote, everyone who is Thai and is qualified can take part in that election. even the family of Taskin Shinawat. We are not hunting Taskin as we did before. We would like to see him come back and fight the legal charges against him. If he is confident he can win, then he will be able to return to politics." End quote. I don't for 1 minute believe that will happen, since the junta has summoned and detained several red shirt Taskin supporters. The NCPO has also set up numerous panels to monitor news organizations and social media. Each panel will have representatives from the police, Army, Navy, Air Force, Foreign Ministry, Prime Minister's Office, Public Relations Department, and other state bodies. Quote, "The creation of these panels constitutes a new age in the gagging of news and information about the Thai military junta," said Benjamin Ishmael, the head of Reporters Without Borders Asia-Pacific Desk. That an interim constitution appears to be ready is a good sign that things are moving forward, especially if he is able to secure the king's endorsement of the new constitution. When that occurs, countries, like the United States that have vocally opposed the coup, may find themselves having to backtrack. The king has already given the general his blessing for the interim rule and will most likely endorse the new constitution. What do you think the United States should do if the king supports General Preut's plan? Should the aid it's withheld since the coup resume? Let us know in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Coming up shortly, depression in Korea. The China Sea isn't the only place Beijing is trying to exert its control. Zhang Zhijun, director of China's Taiwan Affairs Office, made his first trip to the South-ruled island last week to meet with the mayor of the pro-independent southern port of Kaohsiung, Chen Chu. Protesters met Zhang, labeling him a communist bandit. Quote, "We know that Taiwan people cherish very much the social system and the lifestyle they have chosen. We in mainland China respect what Taiwanese people have chosen," said Zhang after the meeting. Over the past few months, Taiwan has been riddled with protests, which Chen explained to Zhang were part of their political system. Quote, "Chen Chu should face the demands of the people and the values of human rights and refrain from the pursuit of economic growth at the expense of Taiwan's hard-earned democratic achievements," said Chen Yunting, part of a group of protesters where Zhang and Chen met. The protests in Taiwan were tame compared to what occurred in Hong Kong earlier this week. July 1st is a day of traditional protests in Hong Kong, coinciding with the handover that occurred in 1997 and the start of the One Country, Two Systems agreement. That agreement allows residents civil liberties not seen on the mainland, including free speech and the right to protest. Concerns have been mounting in Hong Kong that those freedoms are being eroded ever since a white paper was published in June by Beijing. A 10-day unofficial poll providing options for the city's leader was condemned by Beijing on Monday, saying it violated the rule of law and that all candidates must be approved by a nominating committee, leading many to fear candidates might be stacked with pro-Beijing nominees. Chinese University's Hong Kong Institute of Asian Pacific Studies revealed that nearly 44% of Hong Kong residents mistrusted the central government. At the overnight sit-in protest, where organizers say that up to 500,000 people attended, but the police put the number closer to 100,000, 500 were arrested for illegal assembly and obstructing police. Most of those arrested did not struggle, but some had to be forcibly removed. Many of those arrested were released the following day. Protest groups have threatened to disrupt the financial district if their demands for electoral reforms aren't met. With increasing dissatisfaction with Beijing and calls for more protest, what do you think is the future of Hong Kong's democracy? Will China respond with force, or will they find a way to meet in the middle to quell any signs of discontent so it doesn't spill over and affect the island's economy? Before we continue, I'd like to thank QuickPod for their support this week. If you have a camera and are looking to buy a monopod, head on over to quickpod.com. I've been using their monopods for 2 years and have been thoroughly satisfied with their products. They've just released the QuickPod Sport, and I've got to say it's probably their best model yet if you're gonna take a GoPro and go scuba diving. You can check out their website for full details. I know you won't be disappointed. I'm not, and I have 4. A survey released earlier this year showed nearly half of Korean teenagers had suicidal thoughts. The Korean Health Promotion Foundation said 1 in 4 survey respondents said they have no one to talk to. Even more said they turned to friends instead of teachers, counselors, or parents. Quote, "We have social institutions and counselors at schools to help teenagers with stress. But what we need is a mindset in which they utilize those resources just like they would go to a pharmacy or a hospital when they get a cold," said Mo Sang-hyun, a research fellow at the National Youth Policy Institute in Seoul. It may be why the number of suicides in South Korea has risen to 13 in 100,000, even when other developed nations' rates are decreasing. Generally, seeking out psychological treatment in Korea is looked negatively upon. In the days immediately following the Sewol sinking, on-site counselors were dispatched, but grieving parents opted out of the provided therapy. Thankfully, since the surviving students were moved from the southern tip of Korea, they have been getting much-needed help. About 70 second-year students arrived at Danwon High School on June 25th. At a press conference held on site, a young male student said, "We are very tired from the unwanted attention we have been receiving. Please, just treat us like any other 18-year-old. As expected, it was an emotionally charged event. The student continued, "We are still suffering. At first, we couldn't shower. We couldn't sleep. Adults we meet tell us to forget the accident, our friends, and our teachers. But we will not forget, because it's the best we can do." The students who had been staying at the Ansan Small Business Training Institute and undergoing therapy since the sinking were starting classes combining regular curriculum with psychological treatment. Quote, "We consulted with the Gyeonggi Provincial Office of Education and decided it would be better for the students to return because it would be more difficult for them to adapt to classes again if they kept staying at the training institute," explained Park Suk-sun, a spokesperson for the parents. Just over 70 days passed since the Sewol sinking when the students returned to school and the semester was just about to finish. I question if it truly was the best decision. Taking students who have endured significant psychological trauma and placing them back into a fishbowl during finals seems hardly the safest approach, even when the mere mention of reporter causes some to shake with fear. How Korea cares for these young men and women will come under great scrutiny, since it appears to have failed one conscript. On June 20th, Sergeant Eam of the 22nd Infantry Division near Kosong killed 5 of his comrades and fled. What followed was a massive manhunt in which Eam was captured, only after failing to kill himself. Immediately following the shooting spree that started everything, it was made known that Eam was on a list of service persons who require special attention, as he had difficulties adapting himself to the military life. Following Eam's capture, Defense Minister Kim Kwan-jin apologized, saying, "I sincerely apologize to the people and the bereaved families for such a regretful incident in the Eastern Frontline General Outpost that killed 5 and wounded 7. But how did something like this happen? Why would the military place an individual under observation in a high-stress environment? Did Eam have the requisite skills to effectively cope with the situation? And was adequate help available? Investigators looking into the incident are trying to uncover exactly what caused Eam to go on the shooting spree. Kim Min-sok, ministry spokesperson, said Eam had expressed regret for his actions and said bullying drove him to despair and that he felt like a squashed insect. The statements outraged bereft family members, causing them to feel as if their sons were to blame for Eam's actions. Quote, "I think there was a problem with the way the military looked at each of our children. Each of them is the one and only for us," a bereaved father told the media. Minister Kim said, "What we call bullying is in existence at the barracks, but we are investigating whether it was the only cause of his shooting rampage. The ministry is withholding Eam's suicide note in its entirety at the request of the victims' families. Some theorize it's because its contents may shed light on a military culture of bullying. It's something the Army has been trying to eradicate, as the practice has been cited in other suicides and shootings. Another possible reason to withhold the letter might be to deflect blame from the Army. While the unit where Eam was stationed had psychological treatments available, clearly they were either ineffective or underutilized given Eames' special status. If bullying was the cause of the rampage, did the military do enough to end the practice and get Eames the help he needed? It's a question the investigation needs to ask and get a brutally honest answer if the Army truly wishes to end the hazing practice. I can't help but wonder what the psychological fitness levels will be of the surviving Sewol children when it's time for their compulsory service. I have often seen children in Korea unable to keep their emotions in check. When something happens, they boil over in anger and lash out, and sometimes do it violently. Could it be that in this test-driven society, insufficient time is given for emotional growth, that adequate coping mechanisms aren't fully developed, resulting in suicidal thoughts or fatal acts of violence? How do you feel about counseling? Is it just mumbo-jumbo, or can it help troubled individuals? What do children need to develop strong minds and healthy outlooks on life? I hope you'll share your thoughts on this important topic. It's no secret I love the Philippines. After all, my wife's Filipina. I've traveled throughout the archipelago, and to be sure, I have my favorite places. While their famous tourism slogan proclaims it's more fun in the Philippines, Mindanao has been engaged in armed conflict for 5 decades, resulting in the death of over 120,000. Philippine President Benigno Aquino was able to broker a deal with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF, in March of this year and allow for an autonomous government. Quote, "All steps will be done that they can sit already in office by January 2015, he said. If all goes to plan, it will finally bring about much-needed stability in the area and, more importantly, tourists. Many visiting the Philippines stay away from Mindanao, stagnating its economy of the resource-rich region. Some traveling to the Philippines want non-touristy experiences, and Mindanao fits the bill and is absolutely beautiful. But because of numerous travel advisories warning against going there, many opt to visit elsewhere. Hopefully, this peace will last and the region will prosper. But that doesn't mean it will happen all at once. Abu Sayyaf heads another Muslim group in Mindanao, one that's blamed for beheadings, bombings, and kidnappings. The government calls them terrorists, and they could still muck things up for a prosperous future. Those are the stories for this week's show, but let's take a moment and hear what you have to say from last week. Tippa 7 writes in response to Japan's capital punishment laws, "I'm no humanitarian, but surely a lethal injection would be a better alternative than hanging." Ghostbusters 7 added, "I don't think Japan's method of detaining a prisoner on death row is humane, and neither is the method of putting the criminal to death." August Hayuk commented on Chinese expansion issues. The U.S. should recognize the fact that East Asian security issues can no longer be dealt with U.S., Japan, and South Korea relationship. South Korea is going back to where the peninsula always belonged, and that China knows this and is exploiting the whole situation. By far the most divisive comments came from our coverage in the change on Japan's child pornography law. Jim Mullins from the Mully's Place podcast echoed many by saying, "WTF Japan," when it was made known that the country was the last of the OECD and G7 to ban material with real children, but leave manga and animated versions. Pertamont took up the discussion on the other side of the debate, saying, "As a manga fan, I've been hearing this debate for a long time, and my view is that banning any topic in manga is a bad idea. It doesn't stop the pedophiles from thinking about such things. If you could eliminate it that way, wouldn't eliminating gun violence in movies cut down on shootings in real life? Not waiting for Hollywood to do this anytime soon. Underage kids in manga is certainly not the only genre that comes across as negative. Take Guru, NTR, or straight out rape for example. Couldn't pay me to look at these genres regardless of how good the art was or how clever the writing. But I wouldn't think it a good idea to ban it either, since some folks like it. Bottom line is that people need to be held accountable for their own actions, not their thoughts, because nobody can control those. Nobody." From our Asia Now podcast this week, Christopher Mass suspects searchers will never find MH370, and others, like Cherish Adventure, feel the plane was really whisked away to some secret location. Jason Teal had this to say on corporal punishment. My basic observation is that corporal punishment and verbal abuse do not work in the school system. The students have adapted and become detached. They ignore what is being said and the reason why they are being punished. Thus, it simply becomes abuse. I value and welcome your thoughts on the stories that I cover, so please do share them with me in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. I'd like to thank QuickPod for supporting this week's episode, but more importantly, I'd like to thank you for joining me. I hope if you have friends that are interested in Asia, you'll take a moment and consider sharing the podcast with them. If you have any feedback about the show, please fire up your email and send a message to podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. You can always download our episodes from our website, but you can also listen to them on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and TuneIn. Well, that is it for this week's episode. I'm Steve Miller, and until next time, stay true to yourself and always be awesome. Asian News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.